Chicago, known for its iconic skyline deep dish pizza and as the birthplace of jazz. But behind the neon lights and towering buildings lies a darker, more sinister side. From mafia wars to political corruption, racial violence, and modern gang conflicts, Chicago has long been a city marked by crime, chaos, and tragedy. This is the side of the Windy City that tourists rarely see. Today, we uncover the dark side of Chicago. In 1871, the city faced one of the most devastating disasters in its history, the Great Chicago Fire. Though it started with a small flame, it quickly spread, destroying much of the city, leaving over 100,000 people homeless and claiming hundreds of lives. But what followed the fire was perhaps even darker: the exploitation of the disaster, the corruption of reconstruction efforts, and the displacement of entire communities. The Roaring Twenties, an era of flappers, jazz, and bootleg booze. But it was also a time when Chicago became the epicenter of organized crime. The city's streets were ruled by notorious figures like Al Capone, whose empire was built on bootlegging, gambling, and violence. With the passing of Prohibition, the demand for illegal alcohol skyrocketed, and Chicago's underground crime syndicates were only too happy to fill the void. But it wasn't just about money, it was about power. Capone's empire led to some of the most violent and chilling moments in Chicago's history, including the infamous Street Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where 7 men were brutally murdered in broad daylight. And while Capone's reign ended in prison, his legacy of organized crime lived on. It wasn't just the mafia controlling the streets. For decades, the political scene in Chicago was equally corrupted. In 1955, Richard J. Daley was elected mayor of Chicago. He would go on to rule the city for over 20 years, with his political machine holding an iron grip over Chicago's government. Daley's influence was so vast that his power stretched into every corner of the city, from controlling elections to orchestrating deals in public housing. He rewarded loyalty with lucrative city contracts, but for those who stood in his way, they often found themselves in deep trouble. Under his watch, Chicago became a city of power and patronage, a place where the political elite were as dangerous as the criminals on the street. In 1919, Chicago became the battleground for racial violence in what became known as the Red Summer. Tensions had been rising for years, and when an African-American boy drowned in Lake Michigan after being stoned by white youths, it sparked one of the deadliest race riots in the city's history. Over the course of several days, violence spread across the south and west sides, with mobs attacking African-American homes and businesses. Dozens were killed, and hundreds more were injured. The violence laid bare the deep racial divides in the city, divides that persist even to this day. While corruption and violence ran rampant on the streets, there was another dark side to the city's justice system. For over 2 decades, Detective John Burge and his colleagues tortured hundreds of suspects, most of whom were African American, to force confessions. They used methods like suffocation, electric shocks, and even mock executions to extract information. Many of these confessions were later found to be false, leading to wrongful convictions that destroyed lives and shattered families. It wasn't until the 1990s that the full extent of Burge's crimes came to light. But even today, the scars of police brutality in Chicago remain deep, with many victims still fighting for justice. The 1980s and 1990s brought new challenges to Chicago. The crack cocaine epidemic took hold, ravaging entire neighborhoods and fueling gang violence on the south and west sides. Gangs like the Gangster Disciples, Vice Lords, and Latin Kings fought viciously for control of the drug trade. By the early 90s, Chicago had one of the highest murder rates in the country. The city's streets were flooded with violence as young people were drawn into the gang's dangerous world. The war on drugs only escalated the conflict, but despite the efforts, gang violence continues to plague the city to this day. Chicago's violent history doesn't stop with gang wars. The city is also infamous for its serial killers. Perhaps the most notorious was John Wayne Gacy, who preyed on young boys in the 1970s, burying their bodies under his house. Gacy's reign of terror left a permanent scar on the city's psyche, and he remains one of the most chilling figures in its dark history. Today, Chicago is still known for its violence. Despite efforts to curb crime, the city continues to struggle with one of the highest murder rates in the nation. Gang violence, gun crime, and social inequality are constant reminders of the dark side that continues to haunt the city. In 1982, a series of murders rocked the city of Chicago. 7 people died after ingesting Tylenol capsules that had been laced with cyanide. Though the case remains unsolved, the Tylenol murders are a chilling reminder of the city's vulnerability and the dark undercurrents running beneath its surface. From the early 1900s, African Americans migrated to Chicago in large numbers, seeking better opportunities and fleeing the Jim Crow South. But they often found themselves confined to the Black Belt, a segregated neighborhood on the South Side where overcrowding, poverty, and racial tension were a constant reality. This set the stage for not only social unrest, but also the rise of influential figures like the Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Black Panther Party. In 1969, Fred Hampton, a prominent leader of the Black Panther Party, was killed in a police raid. Hampton had been organizing against police brutality and systemic injustice in Chicago. The raid was a part of a larger FBI operation to suppress Black activist groups. His death marked a turning point in the city's relationship with its Black community and brought national attention to the brutal tactics of law enforcement. Baseball in Chicago wasn't immune to corruption. In 1919, 8 players from the Chicago White Sox were accused of throwing the World Series in exchange for gambling money, forever tarnishing the city's image as the center of America's favorite pastime. The scandal not only rocked the sport, but also served as a reminder of the deep-rooted corruption and moral decay that ran through the veins of Chicago. For decades, Chicago's poor neighborhoods were subjected to urban renewal programs that were supposed to improve living conditions, but often had the opposite effect. In areas like Cabrini Green, government housing projects became breeding grounds for crime, poverty, and neglect, and the struggle for affordable housing continues to affect the city's most vulnerable communities. From the rise of the mafia to the scars of racial violence and corruption, Chicago's dark history is a reminder of the cost of power, inequality, and a system that has often failed its people. The ghosts of the past still haunt the streets of the city, and while Chicago has made strides toward progress, the shadows of its troubled history continue to shape its future. Chicago's history is filled with darkness, but it's also a city of resilience and change. From the mafia's grip to the fight for justice, the city continues to evolve. What do you think about Chicago's troubled past and its journey toward the future? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more stories about the cities that shaped the world. Thanks for watching.